So
It said it.
It says it live. And Nicole, sorry, are you recording this?
it records onto YouTube. So
Great.
yes.
Just since we're missing a few and we're talking about PIP reporting, I'd like to be able to send the link around.
Yeah, well, it'll definitely be posted onto the website under the committee, and I can send it out to all of our board members as well.
Thank you so much. All
Sure.
right, Jesse, I know you've
All
got
right.
a script.
Welcome everybody to the Tracking and Communicating Outcomes, or TACO. Thanks, Ken Fetcho, for that acronym. Board committee meeting, December 10th. It's nice to see everybody. Just a quick reminder that this virtual meeting is being live streamed on OWEB's YouTube channel and it's being recorded. For those that are watching on YouTube, meeting materials are in the board and committee section of the OWEB website. The committee materials are toward the bottom of the page, and you can click on the relevant committee and have access to the current meeting materials as well as past meeting recording. We're going to shift to introductions of committee members and OWEB staff members. I'll just call on folks. So Jesse Kirschner, representing OSU Extension and with Oregon Sea Grant, non-voting board member. So I'll turn it over to Annie.
Good morning. Thank you. My name is Annie Burney. I am with NOAA Fisheries, the Willamette team lead. Yes.
Welcome, Annie. Your first committee meeting.
Yeah. I feel the pressure, but
there's no pressure. This is the least pressure committee of all the committees right now.
Okay, good.
So just enjoy. So how about Sarah?
Hi, everybody. Sarah O'Brien, OWEB's Executive Director. Welcome, Annie. Good to join the meeting and good to have you here. I'm going to need to step out briefly at 9:30 and then come back, so apologies for that.
Thanks, Sarah. Stephanie.
Good morning. Stephanie Page, Deputy Director at OWEB.
Eric.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Eric Hartstein, Senior Policy Coordinator at OWEB. Great to be here today.
Jillian.
Good morning, everyone. Jillian McCarthy. I'm a Partnerships Coordinator, primarily in the Focused Investment and Partnership Program at OWEB. Nice to see everyone.
Lovely to see you, Jillian. It's been a while. Denise.
Good morning, Denise Hoffert, also Partnerships Coordinator at OWEB, working with our FIT partnerships and also manage the Partnership Technical Assistance Grant offering. Nice to see everyone.
Thanks, Denise. Nicole.
Good morning, everyone. Nicole Betnardi. I am OWEB's Executive Assistant and Board Liaison.
I think that's the most subdued introduction you've ever given, Nicole.
I'm jumping jacks over here.
Okay. Let's go to the OWEB, I'll say boardroom, but I know that's not what it is. But Courtney, Ken, and Audrey.
Good morning, everyone. Courtney Schaff, Monitoring and Reporting Program Manager.
Audrey Hatch, Conservation Outcomes Coordinator with OWEB staff.
Good morning. My name is Ken Fetcho. I am OWEB's Effectiveness Monitoring Coordinator and Tribal Liaison.
And Andrea.
Hi all, thanks for having me in here. I'm Andrea Kreiner, Executive Director of the Oregon Association of Conservation Districts, and I will probably go off screen, but I didn't want to be like a lurker initially, so.
That's fair. Thanks, Andrea. Okay, so for our agenda today, I don't believe we have any public comment. I'm looking to Nicole to confirm. No public comment. Okay. So first up, we're going to preview a quantifying conservation outputs and outcomes delegated award. And then we'll shift to focused investment reporting presentation and discussion. And then we'll do some wrap up at the end. So I think with that, I'll turn it over to Courtney would be my guess.
Yes. Thanks, Jesse. So this is a staff report that was both posted on the website and sent to committee members. And we're doing this as an opportunity to preview some information for the committee. This is an activity that has happened a couple times in the history of OWEB, where we received an application through the open solicitation cycle that is operating currently right now, a monitoring application that really aligns with our quantifying outcomes, outputs, and outcomes line item of the spending plan. So as we talked about in the staff report, over the history of OWEB, there's been a couple times where landscape scale monitoring applications have been submitted. These typically are applications that cover multiple years. They're collecting data that is both really broad geographically and temporally, and the results of the monitoring help inform our grantees not just at the site-specific location, but really broadly across multiple OWEB regions, multiple watersheds, and the data is really important at a broader scale. So we received one of those applications for the most recent open solicitation cycle, and as we were reviewing the applications and looking at available funding, Ken and I recognized that the 23-25 spending plan had delegated funds through the quantifying outputs and outcomes line item that hadn't been fully expended. And they were still sitting there in that holding account. And the intent from Audrey, Ken, and I had been to continue to invest in both telling the restoration story and other quantifying outputs and outcomes effectiveness monitoring projects with those funds. We determined that this project, the Sustaining Long-Term Fish Habitat Monitoring in the Middle Fork John Day IMW, really fit the intent of those funds. And so, as you can see through the staff report, are using a process that we've used in the past where we've asked the grantee to withdraw that application from the open solicitation grant cycle. And we are going to be using the previously delegated funds. So these funds have already been delegated by the board. And we'll be working with Ken to have them resubmit the application and funded through the delegated award process. Because these funds were already delegated by the board, we're not going in front of the board in January and asking for an action. And so we wanted this committee just to have a chance to preview this action, see if there's any questions. And then also for transparency's sake, this board delegated action will be reported on through this committee report at the January board meeting, and it'll show up in Sarah's director's report when she shows which grants were delegated funds from the last quarter. The other follow-up action that Ken and I are going to be doing post-January is meeting with the John Day Basin IMW, Middle Fork IMW, and just talking about what is their long-term funding vision. They have been historically funded through the Pacific States Marine Fisheries Commission. That funding is waning. And so we want to have a long-term conversation with them because we don't think this landscape scale project is probably the best fit for open solicitation, and want to continue to have conversations with them about long-term funding ideas and how it fits within the OWEB board's quantifying outputs and outcomes spending plan and long-term objectives. Ken, anything to add?
Well, I'll just say that before we came to this solution, if you will, or proposed solution or idea of how to fund this project, it was reviewed through the Oregon Plan Monitoring Team. And so it did have several strengths identified. And so it was recommended for funding.
Yeah,
and
that's
so
a great point.
I wanted to emphasize that it had really reviewed really well. This was a super competitive cycle. I talked about it a little bit with Courtney when we presented to the board in Astoria during our Monitoring 101 session, where 34 monitoring applications came in. Several of those were recommended for funding, and the funding lines, were drawn. And so by doing this, it enables us to fund another solid application that was below the funding line.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. Jesse or Annie, any questions?
I have two. First, so it's $676,000. It's a good amount of money. Can you tell me the timeline of the project? Like, how many years is this covering for long-term monitoring?
I can cover that. So when this project was submitted, they were recommending the monitoring to start right in January of next year after you guys make the award, and it was going to continue through, with the analysis and reporting into 2028. So they were proposing 2 years of monitoring, but often this happens in these applications, the scope of work extends beyond so that it can analyze and report the results. And so you could call it 2.5 years, maybe 3 years broadly. The thing is, though, is so the funds that we get that support this IMW are discretionary funds from NOAA. They give those to PSNFC. PSNFC gives those to the state of Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. OWEB is the Oregon recipient. They after they submitted the application, they gave us another round of funding that extends through June of 2026. So this project will actually begin July of 26. And so that's why we're there. If you guys are supportive, we are going to ask them to make some changes to that timeline. And reduce the funding to the available funds that we have. We have $567,000. So the budget will come down. We had been talking, and they're talking amongst the partners on how they can reduce that, still, meet the goals and objectives of the project. And so I hope that helps answer your question, Jesse, around the timeline, because there's multiple things that are affecting that.
Yeah, and that was going to be my other question, just how much of the budget was this using of the remaining funding? And it sounds like it will use up the remaining funding for the 23-25.
Yes, it'll use up the remaining funding from the 23-25. As we have been, and even before, as we were looking at the number of monitoring applications that came in, and as we've been brainstorming about the demand and open solicitation monitoring, we really quickly identified that, I think it's a bigger priority within the state to continue to invest in monitoring versus the nice to haves, which has been some of the telling the restoration stories and other projects. And so we quickly identified the idea of using those 23-25 delegated funds to support some of the monitoring. And then when we did the evaluation, this one reviewed so high, and we recognize that it fit better with this quantifying outcomes, it became a kind of a logical approach. But we will be asking them to revise their application, revise the timing, and then reduce their request to align with the available funding. So they'll be reducing their request by about $100,000.
Okay.
Other questions?
I don't have any.
Annie, do you have any questions for them? No? Okay.
Yeah, I'll just say that we have supported the Middle Fork IMW with these quantifying conservation outputs and outcomes funding to supplement the federal funding that the IMW has benefited from over the years since 2008. And so,
and I think in the future, it'll be a good opportunity to probably, Ken and I will bring back the conversation we have with the Middle Fork IMW, share with this committee, and likely would like to have some conversations about the quantifying outcome spending line item with this committee and future investments into the 27-29 biennium before we adopt the spending plan. I have to think hard when I say future biennium because my brain kind of hurts sometimes. Okay, with that, I think we're gonna move to the next agenda item. Okay, well, Annie, this is a perfect presentation, perfect meeting for you to jump in and join OWEB for, because one of the things this committee's really been leaning in on is some one-on-one opportunities. There's been just a couple, there really hasn't been a place within OWEB's committees for a while where we could have conversations about some of the bigger picture things we're working on, and some of the monitoring and reporting on outcomes. And one of those reporting on outcomes things is through our Focused Investment Partnership Program, where Audrey has worked really closely with our FIP staff over the years to create documents, to track our FIPs, and to report on the outcomes to the FIPs, and bring that information back to the board at key times in the life cycle of the FIP to help the board make decisions. And so the focus of our presentation today is to really walk through like FIP reporting 101. Like, how did it start? Like, what was our vision of FIP reporting when we got started? Where are we now? And then really we're hoping to get some input from both you and Jesse about where are some logical places for us to go in the future as we think about FIP reporting, and what is achievable, and what have we done. And so both Jillian and Denise are here today because they manage the FIPs and they're really interested in this conversation. So even though we have been on Zoom for years now, I'm never quite as apt as I want to be. So let me get my screen shared here. Okay.
Courtney, when I shifted from being on Zoom full time when I was in the nonprofit world to Teams, it felt like the most foreign thing in the world. And now, after a year and a half, I think I'm on the same wavelength as you. I feel weird when I'm back on Zoom now, but it kind of feels like my old office too.
So we've already done, this is kind of what we're planning to run through today. We've already done introductions, but we're going to talk about the history of the FIP reporting, the products, the monitoring, and what we're trying to achieve post-FIP, and then have a general discussion. Eric Hartstein and Audrey are pretty much going to tag team this presentation because Eric has a lot of the history, and one of the FIPs we're going to focus on today is one of his favorites, the Ashland. And really what we're trying to achieve with having this conversation with all of you is the understanding of, is anyone else clear? There it goes. Okay. How FIP reporting has evolved over time. I actually went back and listened to some of the initial board meetings when we adopted the FIPs and when the first FIPs were reporting back to the board, and what did the board want to hear and learn about the FIPs way back when we started them with our first cohort. And then Eric's going to give a little bit of like, where is that first cohort now? And I think that's going to help ground everyone in what is achievable when we're talking about FIP reporting. Right. How FIP reporting looks very different at the beginning, middle, and end of the FIP, and how we're trying to adapt our products and our reporting schedule to be realistic about what is achievable at the beginning, middle, and end. And then, post-FIP reporting, we're still trying to figure out what is achievable post-FIP, and really looking forward to some thoughts and any input you all have. Please ask questions, raise your hand at any time. We really want this to be as much of a discussion as possible. And I think it's on to Eric.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Courtney. And would you mind maybe going back a slide? There we go. Thanks. All right. So we'll talk a little bit about history of FIP reporting, kind of starting with early expectations. So of course, early on, we're talking the 2015, 2017 biennium. It was expected that each partnership would receive 3 biennia of funding, so 6 years of funding, with regular progress reports to the board. And some of that initial reporting, and this is really over the first couple of biennia, included a list and a status report of projects that each FIP partnership was implementing, along with a narrative report responding to questions around challenges that the partnerships were having, successes that they wanted to illustrate for the board, and then progress made on the trajectory to measure the ecological outcomes associated with their initiative. The progress tracking reports that I know, Jesse, you've seen, and Annie, you may have seen, and Audrey will kind of get into that discussion in detail here in a minute. Those are actually developed outside of this initial reporting, and were later actually incorporated into the board reports. It's important to, I think, separate or at least understand that when we're talking about reporting with FIPs, that there's initiative reporting, and then there's also the project level reporting. Because with the FIP initiatives, they are implementing projects that have associated the usual OWEB reporting requirements. So what was accomplished with that project, photo points, metrics, etc. So when we're talking about FIP initiative reporting, we're asking partnerships to roll up some of those project level results that actually sometimes they might have different metrics than that they're interested in reporting at the initiative level and what they have reported with their project level grants. So this is also kind of a challenge when we're talking about rolling up metrics across partnerships or by ecological priorities, as partnerships may be tracking metrics differently in a manner that really works for them. And we want to really avoid prescribing an approach to partnerships. So next slide, please. Okay, so where are they now? So these are the cohort 1 FIPs, again, that were funded in the 2015-2017 biennium. Actual funding came in January of 2016. And I think this really illustrates some of the challenges with reporting in the FIP program, because I think we've learned that in FIP initiatives take a long time to complete. So with this map, it has the 6 cohort 1 FIP partnerships, and 3 of them are still working on completing projects within their FIP. And so those are the projects that are working in the aquatic habitat for native fish habitat priority. And I think the reasons why they're continuing to be working on this is that it's really complex working in this priority, as it involves designing projects, permitting, which takes an awful long time, and working within open in-water work periods. And all this kind of adds up to, it could take several years to implement one of the more complex in-stream habitat projects. For the other 3 cohort 1 FIPs, those that are kind of working outside of river restoration, those are the partnerships working in Sage Steppe, Oregon Model to Protect Sage Grouse, and the Harney Basin Wetlands Collaborative. They completed their initiatives a few years back, and actually both were awarded second FIPs last year. The Ashland Forest FIP, which we'll talk about here a little bit more later, also wrapped up their initiative several years ago. And many of those partners are now working on the Rogue Forest and the Klamath Siskiyou Oak Network FIPs. So with that, I'll pass the mic over to Audrey for some FIP reporting products.
Yeah, thank you, Eric Hartstein. We will spend a few minutes going over the content, what is in the progress tracking reports. We'll look at what they are, how they're created and used, and we will also see how they have evolved over time. And emphasizing one of the things that my colleague Eric just said, these progress tracking reports have really been designed to describe progress toward the near-term and longer-term ecological outcomes cumulatively. And because these FIP investments represent a large scope and scale compared with individual project level investments at OWEB, since the beginning of the initiative, there was a lot of interest in having a broader, meaningful reporting that would complement and go alongside and be in addition to the project level reporting that's an already existing part of the OWEB funding model. So next, in order to, yes, thank you. To understand the progress tracking reports and how they've changed over time, we're going to take a minute thinking about the theory of change. That is a phrase that means as funders, as practitioners and managers, we have an idea about how the strategies and actions that that we implement are expected to lead to those near-term and longer-term outcomes. And this slide steps through the key elements of a theory of change for the Ashland Forest All Lands Restoration Initiative. The theory of change is part of the initiative in several ways. First, for FIPs, there is a broad theory of change for each of the FIP ecological priorities. So for example, for the Ashland FIP, partners and OWEB staff looked at a theory of change for the dry type forest ecological priority. So that ecological priority theory of change is identified by OWEB board action. Is identified by the board, and there is an action expected coming up in January, following up an in-depth presentation in October about ecological priorities. And so that information on the FIP, ecological priority theory of change, is made available on the OWEB webpage for applicants and reviewers to work with. To find that information on ecological priority theory of change from the main OWEB page, navigate to grant programs, and then to focused investment partnerships. Another way the theory of change comes in is when a partnership works on an initiative application for the FIP. They develop and bring in their own strategic action plan, and that includes a specific progress monitoring framework that really describes what they propose can realistically be addressed and tracked throughout the initiative. So the partnership takes the lead in identifying their goals, strategies, and actions, and then describes what near-term outcomes and longer-term outcomes are anticipated to result from their work through that strategic action plan. Over time at OWEB and working with FIP partnerships, we have found that tracking outputs, such as the number of acre spend or number of native plants installed or miles of off-channel habitat open, for example, those outputs are more realistic to track over the 3 biennia of FIP funding. Ecological outcomes take much more time and often collaborative monitoring efforts to become evident. This is true of even those near-term ecological outcomes. And we can head to the next slide, please. So a theory of change is important in developing the progress tracking reports. We'll take a minute to look at how that works on the slide. So progress tracking reports are produced on regular intervals to help the board and partners understand progress towards outcomes, desired outcomes. And so for each of these progress tracking reports, some foundational elements include that ecological priority theory of change, information coming in through the application, and the initiative's strategic action plan. The partnership develops a more specific progress monitoring framework that's a subset usually of that larger theory of change and strategic action plan. So with that subset, they then select and identify the output metrics that they will track over time. And while this is happening throughout the life of the initiative, we know actions are being implemented and the initiative is being managed adaptively throughout. These progress tracking reports are produced collaboratively. OWEB staff take the lead on gathering existing data from the initiative application, from OWEB databases, and provide the partnership with a template that's based on their strategic action plan and theory of change. And the reason for that is so those outputs that are going to be tracked through time are really clearly and transparently linked to outcomes. So for each PTR, the partnership finalizes and quantifies their output metrics. The partnership provides feedback through the template about the initiative context, the actions, the monitoring approach, and how their work is being adaptively managed through time. And final reports are then shared with the board. And we can go to the next slide, please. And the next couple of slides, we'll just walk through the key components of each progress tracking report, putting it together to show how the progress tracking report connects to that theory of change. Using an example full page, this is usually around page 2 of each report. It's shown here using the Clackamas FIP. That overall FIP initiative goal is at the top, and it's followed by the key strategies the partnership identified to achieve their goal, then some accomplishments unique to a reporting biennium or progress bubbles. These can include restoration actions as well as outreach and engagement metrics. This is really a place where the partnership can highlight some creative work that they are doing during that reporting time period. For example, some things that have been highlighted here: producing a movie, pivoting to online engagement during COVID, or unique and meaningful ways to engage with landowners, as well as restoration and monitoring outcomes that folks want to highlight specifically during this reporting period. And then finally, at the bottom of the page, keeping us accountable are those near-term and longer-term outcomes from the partnership.
And just taking a minute to to emphasize what Audrey has hit on in a couple of the slides is what we've recognized from the beginning to this point in time is what our FIT partners can really report on is these near-term outputs. And this is a great way to demonstrate to the board and other partners what they're able to achieve between each progress tracking report is what's been done in the bubbles, the stuff on the ground, the engagement with the community, and it ties to the near-term and long-term outcomes. But what we're able to highlight and track at a realistic time frame is these actual outputs.
Thanks, Courtney. In addition to what we just looked at, typically on page 2 of each report, every report includes detailed info on funding, a monitoring approach, information on adaptive management, and then we'll take a look at the progress bars where that subset of outputs we talked about that's tracked continuously, cumulatively through time is shown. We'll take a quick look at each section for the funding information and kind of how this is shown in each of the progress tracking reports. This has changed over time based on feedback from board members and others. So funding information is now shown by each of the OWEB grant types. So engagement, monitoring, technical assistance, partnership technical assistance, and restoration. And then for each of those funding types, what is shown includes the amount that was proposed in the application, what folks thought they would use or need for monitoring, engagement, and the other grant types, what's been paid to date, and what's obligated in a grant agreement, meaning that specific projects have been approved by a technical review team. And funding information is shown cumulatively with each report. And this section also includes the estimated total amount of matching funds leveraged by a partnership at the time of application when they made that estimate. So OWEB and others have learned over time there's often additional or more matching funds leveraged than initially anticipated. That information becomes available to us when the projects are completed and the grant's formally closed out. So that's when we can get that best estimate of the actual amount of match that was leveraged. And we'll have a little bit more to say about that later on. Next slide, we want to say that each report gives the partnership an opportunity to include a section about their monitoring approach. This section is optional, but it is often included in the progress tracking reports. Partnerships often want to take the opportunity to talk about the monitoring work that they're doing and really recognize that is happening oftentimes within the context of many other funders and other initiatives or partners. Maybe only a small section or subset of the monitoring work is covered through OWEB monitoring funding within the life of the initiative. And as we mentioned earlier, it takes many years and many groups working together to leverage the expertise to get the monitoring that really would quantify those near-term and longer-term outcomes. And an example shown here is from the Clackamas FIT, where Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Johnson Creek Watershed Council are working together to lead longer-term effectiveness monitoring efforts. And then next slide, we will take a look at the adaptive management section included in each of the reports. This is a place for the partnership to really describe challenges they faced, lessons learned to help, lessons learned coming out of those challenges, and then the adaptations that the partnership has made to address and adjust to these unforeseen challenges. For example, this can be the section to describe shifts in funding allocations compared with what was envisioned at the time of application. So sometimes we see, oh, we thought we would need a certain amount of engagement funding. We actually needed more to really get the work done. So those types of things can be written up here and highlighted. And then this information we've heard is useful for, it's part of each of these reports to the board, but it is also useful for natural resources practitioners working in similar ecological priorities. And finally, the final section we'll take a quick look at, thank you. Just one moment. And take a look at the progress tracking bars. that are included in each of the reports. Again, this is an example from the Clackamas most recent progress tracking report. This section is usually around page 3, and this is where you see that reporting on that subset of strategies and progress towards outputs identified through the progress monitoring framework. So the partnership establishes targets in collaboration with OWEB staff, and you'll see the targets shown on the right-hand side of the slide, kind of and then shown in the brown bars. And then progress on the outputs is shown here in the green bars. And so these strategies, these 5 or so, are the ones that are tracked consistently throughout the initiative, and then progress can be reported cumulatively on that same set of strategies through time. Next slide, please.
So I think just highlighting that here on this one, you're showing that this initiative achieved more than they set out to through their PIP initiative.
In some of those, right?
Yeah, if we take a minute to look. So again, the objectives or targets are shown in brown, and these are set by the partnership in collaboration with OWEB. So you know, they were thinking at the time that they put together this list of strategies to track over time, hey, you know, we think we can probably achieve 3.38 miles of additional off-channel access. And they actually achieved a little bit more than that, 4.09 miles, and exceeded their target in a couple of these measures. And Largewood Place, to restore that third strategy there, they didn't quite achieve that target. They're a little bit below. And so the purpose of these bars is just to show kind of cumulatively over time, what did we achieve? Where did we exceed? Where did we not quite meet that objective? Why might that be? We can talk about that in the adaptive management section.
Yep, thanks. And I think these are some of the things that we want to highlight for you all as board members to think about. This is the information that we're presenting through these progress tracking reports that you'll see at different times in the life cycle of the FIP. And are they informative? Are they helping you understand the story that's happening through the FIPs?
Thank you, Courtney. And then just the last item about the content of these reports. There's been quite an evolution, and you can see in kind of the look and feel of the report. So the approach has always been really grounded in that theory of change. And the approach was developed through a strong collaboration with OWEB and the Bonneville Environmental Foundation. And we've heard feedback over time and adapted to the format and look and feel of the documents. And you can see how they have changed a little bit since the first ones were produced around 2017 over on the left, and then in 2021 shown over to the right. And then just, you can see the funding information on page 1 of these. And then just recall a few minutes ago, we talked about how we've added additional detail on the funding categories going forward. And then finally, next slide, the most recent suite of these was provided to the board in January of this year, as shown on the slide. All current and past reports are published on the OWEB website. You can see the link on the screen, and you can navigate there by selecting the grant program tab from the OWEB webpage, and then the focused investment partnerships, and then click on view funded initiatives and progress reports. And these are intended to be used as a suite of publications that describe progress and throughout the life of the FIP. And in addition to the OWEB board, the reports are useful to help legislators and policymakers understand what is resulting from OWEB's investments. And then partnerships may also identify their own audience for their reports and share them through their own communication avenues. And the last thing I'm going to say here is that based on board feedback, to have more meaningful and complete reports, and then we'll talk about a post-FIP report here in a minute that would include final output and funding numbers. We are now working with the partnerships to produce 3 reports for each initiative on a longer time frame. So we will not be producing one every biennium going forward. That is the end of the section on the progress tracking reports.
Thanks, Audrey.
If anybody wants to add.
All right, now, so we've been really focusing on what we're bringing to the board for each FIP And as Audrey said, we're kind of changing the time frame of when we're doing the FIP reporting, progress tracking reports now, both trying to relieve some workload from our partners and from staff, and trying to figure out when is the opportune time to gather the data, roll it up, and share it with the board and share it with partners. But the other thing we've been talking about since cohort 1 launched is how do we report on FIPs post-FIP? As Eric touched on at the beginning, they're not just putting a big bow on them at the end of 6 years. It actually takes a little bit longer than that. And the Ashland All Lands Restoration is a great example of some of the positive trajectories and some of the challenges of doing post-FIP reporting. Eric,
Yeah, thanks, Courtney. So a couple of years ago, several years ago, 2021 to be specific, in an effort, so hearing this, that there would be this interest in post-FIP reporting, so to better understand how that could work, the agency funded a pilot with the Ashland Forest All Lands Restoration Initiative. And so that was originally funded in 2021, work began in 2022. It is still in progress with draft products anticipated to be available in March of 2026. And then the project scheduled to complete around this time next year in fall of 2026. And so this pilot project that you can hear from the timeline has been challenging to scope, even with a committed longstanding partnership with a real interest in the products that could result from the post-FIP reporting and a community and audience ready to use those products. It's still been challenging. And therefore, OWEB has modified our approach to think about producing consistent post-FIP reports for every initiative. We've heard from the board it would be useful to have that final actual match information and the final completed output metrics from the restoration projects that are funded in that post-FIP report. So because of the long-term nature of that work and those restoration efforts, the completion reporting is several years out from each biennial funding cycle of the FIP initiative, as we will see on the next slide. And this shows the timeline for FIP reporting going forward. So you can see when the PTRs will be presented, and we can also look at the timing for potential post-FIP reports. And so we have heard that interest in showing those final numbers, that final amount of match. And you can kind of see by looking at the first couple of rows for cohorts 1 through 3 of FIP initiatives, it is typically several years until an initiative is far enough along to be in that place where that information is available to produce a post-FIP report. As Eric was talking about kind of at the beginning when we looked at where are the cohort 1 FIPs right now. So one takeaway here by looking at the timeline is that it's going to be a while before a cohort is really fully post-FIP and we can produce those reports consistently. So looking at what's coming up next, going forward, the current suite of cohort 4 FIPs will provide their first completed progress tracking report in January of 2027. So that will be at the beginning of their second biennium and just ahead of a board funding decision about the third biennium of funding. Additionally, OWEB staff provide updates to the board for each FIP at the end of its biennium 1, heading into biennium 2. So the board must approve funding each biennium for existing FIPs, and the board will receive additional information, including the FIP budget and work plan, at April meetings of the odd numbered years to help inform those decisions. So those are kind of the staff report outs to the board that happen in April. And then one item we're hearing from you today, leading into the next slide, is just your thinking, what information helps the board make these funding decisions as FIPs move from one biennium to the next. Thank you, Courtney and Eric.
Yeah, and as we open this up for a little bit of discussion, Eric, I just thought I'd see, is there anything you want to add on the Ashland post-FIP reporting, or anything else on Ashland?
Yeah, thanks, Courtney. I mean, I think Audrey covered it pretty well. I mean, Ashland Forest FIP and the partnership is, you know, a really good example. They were able to implement their initiative rather quickly and, you know, have their metrics that they want to track, you know, pretty well aligned. And it's a good illustration of just, you know, how challenging it could be, you know, given all that to come up with, you know, the final, I think Audrey or Courtney said it, kind of the bow on the package. So I think the approach that we're taking of kind of keeping it simple, having that third progress tracking report being that final post-FIP report is going to be a real good move into the future.
And the other question I was going to ask you, Eric, at the beginning, you talked about, like, when we started the FIP initiative, we got narrative reports with questions you sent to the FIPs, and then they emailed responses back. You're not doing that anymore, correct? That process has changed.
So that's included with the template that's sent out to them. So it's essentially similar information, and then I'll turn to Eric to see kind of if it's that same project level.
Yeah. It's now kind of reflected in the progress tracking reports, and then the FIP partnerships present to the board at that January meeting in advance of their next biennium of funding. So that's when they'll have an opportunity to kind of present their progress independent of the tracking report.
But trying to streamline and package that stuff as one product versus, like, before, I think at the beginning we were trying to do multiple products.
Yeah. And you know, another thing I might just add is that, you know, the calendar that Audrey had that went out to 2033, which is, yeah, thanks, which is weird to look at. But you know, we wanted to keep this relatively light and not real busy. But you know, if you were to go back in those cohort, you know, particularly 3 and 4, everything was kind of truncated because, well, really because of COVID. I mean, we ended up having FIPS funded halfway through a biennium, and then the reporting just got out of whack, really. And there was no, a really good opportunities for the FIP partnerships to ramp up and have, you know, successes to demonstrate before the board ahead of individual biennium awards. So I think as we're going into cohort 5, you see that the board will be selecting the next set of FIPs in January 2027. And there's that ramp up period before the board even funds the FIPs in July 2027. So they'll have, you know, almost 2 years to get things on the ground or get things prepared to go on the ground, which should, I think, really help the board in seeing progress that's being made.
Yeah.
So thanks. This is Ken Fetcho, Eric, for bringing us back to the simplified version of what the future may hold, right? And it's just really important to note that not every partnership within a cohort will be done completing all their open grants at the same time, right? So cohort 1, right, we're now December 25, there are still 3 partnerships with open grants completing restoration projects. And they're not all going to end at the same time. And so that's why it's hard to schedule out post-FIP reports. And so just keep that in mind. That falls true for, you know, cohorts 2, 3, and 4, which are currently active, you know, also working on open grants that were funded through the FIP.
So I think going back to this, and I think Annie, you did say in an email that you have to leave it at 10, and Jesse has been around and aware of the FIP program for a while. But is it you all are, you know, hearing from the FIPs and having the presentations as we bring them to the board, as you make future spending plan decisions and FIP investment decisions? Are there pieces of what we've shared today that resonated with you, that seemed like, yes, that is the information I need to be an informed board member to understand these landscape scale, long-term investments that OWEB is making. Are there lessons learned from other programs that you think we should consider for reporting purposes? Or are there pieces of information that we're not touching on that you think would be helpful?
Annie, I want to give space for you.
Yeah, no, I don't have really much to add. I think it was a great presentation. I was trying to think about Courtney's questions. But I think these reports are really, really great to have. I know sometimes, you know, in my role as an open solicitation team member, you don't always get these kind of, I guess it wouldn't be called tracking reports, but kind of like how different watershed councils or jurisdictions are approaching restoration, say, and how much success they've been having. And in the watershed, it's not as thorough. So I really appreciate this for the purpose of these focus investments. It's very helpful, especially since it can be 6 years. So,
Jesse, how about you? You've been on both sides of it. Thoughts or ideas?
I have questions.
Okay.
I'm curious about when the FIP originated and the board approved it. Was there discussion? I mean, to the point that like we're really looking at outputs, we're not looking at these longer term outcomes. Was that something that the board recognized at the time and had discussions about like how do we want to look at longer term outcomes? Or like has that been a part of the discussion through time with the board?
And I'll have Eric jump in. But so I went back and listened to some of the initial board meetings. And it was really interesting. There was a dialogue between Ryan Houston and Will. I'm totally blanking on Will's last name. Yeah.
Nice.
And Ryan Houston, Deschutes SIP and then Deschutes FIP was saying that it would cost about 50% of their FIP funding and around there to be able to actually get to long-term outcomes and not just outputs. And just talking about the cost it would take and the staff and that they would need to seek significant additional investments outside OWEB to achieve that. And so I think Ryan set some pretty realistic of what they could achieve with just the funding they were receiving from the OWEB board. But there was definitely a desire from some of our early board members as we were launching the FIP to get to more of the outcomes. And there have been a lot of lessons learned about what is achievable in the monitoring, what is achievable to report out, and also just how long these are taking. But Eric, and I saw Sarah come off mute, but for Eric, anything to add?
Yeah, I think we captured it pretty well, Courtney. You know, the initial discussions were around moving from outputs to outcomes. And I don't know if anybody really thought that the reality would be that these projects take a long time. And also can be a little bit easier in some places to get to something approaching outcomes. I think of the SAGE STEP priority, and they have the ecological estate model that they're using to, you know, the landowners that have signed up for the sage grouse program, that the districts go out and every 5 or 10 year interval, they're going out and looking at the landscape where they've done work and have sort of a sliding, it's kind of like letter grades, A through F or something. And it's sort of reflective of that too. A is like, hey, it's excellent. This is great sagebrush state, and kind of going down the line, you get a little bit more invasive weeds and maybe some juniper and then you're into state D or E, and they've then track over that 5-year interval what that state looks like. And this is over a 30-year commitment. So in that circumstance, they're able to, I think, demonstrate kind of the outcomes that result from the projects that they're doing. But that's over a very long time scale, and I don't know if that is repeatable across most or even some of our FIP partnerships, given the lack of resources that are associated with monitoring that Courtney talked about in those initial discussions with the OWEB board.
Jillian?
Yeah, thanks, Courtney. I just wanted to add, Jesse, in response to your question there, and point back to the theory of change that Audrey was describing in her presentation. So, I mean, that's really the logic between the strategies, the actions, right, the outputs, and eventually the outcomes. And so if the science is there to support that theory of change, then you can feel pretty confident, or OWEB as a funder can feel pretty confident that those actions being implemented and the resulting outputs are going to lead to those outcomes eventually, or help lead to some of those outcomes eventually. And this also then allows, as Courtney was saying, some of the earlier comments, for the FIP funding to be more focused on the restoration and more projects on the ground, and not as much on monitoring that is more complex when you're looking for outcomes. Just thought I would mention that, pointing back to that theory of changes. That's why it's so important.
Thanks, Jillian. Ken had something, and then Denise, and then back to Jesse.
Jillian, you nailed it. That's what we did communicate that to the board, right? The FIP program says a FIP investment achieves clear and measurable ecological outcomes, right? So how do you do that? That's what we're grappling with. And so staff, and we worked with Bonneville Environmental Foundation after the FIP program was established. How do we do this? And that's where they recommended, they being Bonneville Environmental Foundation, the theory of change. And so we embraced that. And we did communicate that with the board over time. Like, we're going to take this approach.
Thanks, Ken.
Yeah. So thank you, Jillian.
Denise?
Yeah, I just want to chime in to say that there has been questions about whether OWEB would have a role at looking at long-term ecological outcomes ourselves, rather than asking our partners on the ground to conduct this. And just to illustrate one small challenge, I had a lengthy phone call with one of our grantees yesterday who is trying to wrap up a project that was awarded in 2017. And so the organization has been through several coordinators. They had some, pressure transducers that were installed in 2019, but at some point the wires attaching those rusted out. Those transducers floated away in a flood event. They don't have that data. And so there was a really well-intentioned plan to conduct, some monitoring that would be able to look at outcomes at this site. But with the challenges that these really small organizations have with maintaining staffing and maintaining continuity over time, to get to outcomes monitoring is, I think, a little unrealistic to put that on most of our partners. So the conversation about doing it at the agency level is maybe one to raise back up again.
Thanks, Denise.
Yeah, I guess that's sort of where I was maybe more coming from with my question, is just, I don't think it's fair to put this on the partners. It's certainly not fair to ask them to do it for free. If it's, you really want the money in the FIP investment to go to restoration. I get that, and the work on the ground. But that said, we just talked about a delegated award for a intensively monitored watershed that's been funded since 2008 in monitoring. And I guess the value of maybe not asking those partners to go back and monitor, but to do a survey or some kind of a study 10 years after FIP implementation that gets it, hopefully assessing some of those ecological outcomes. Like, to me, that sounds something the board should think about in terms of when we delegate money for FIP, like for the FIP pot. Like, do we say in 10 years, like, we want to make sure to set some money aside that's going to go towards somebody studying outcomes in this in a cohort 1 FIP area to let us take a look at this. So it's just something that I was curious to see if that's something the board has wrestled with in the past or discussed in the past, of like how do we set that up where it's not on the grantees, it's not on these small organizations, but it is something we want to be thinking about and looking at because of the investment that we're putting in these places.
Great questions, Jesse. And I think I would imagine some opportunities for this committee to wrestle with some of those questions in the future. Not just you. When we have our
committee member on currently.
But I appreciate it. And I think it's one of the conversations, FIP staff have been wrestling with, and we wanted to start having with this committee about what's it make sense to look at and report out on, and at what scale when we're talking about the FIPs.
And to your question about lessons learned from other reporting, I can tell you that for our reporting, because we do pretty rigorous federal reporting to NOAA for our grants, and two things stand out to me in what we report, because we do have to report a lot of like measures and metrics similar to like miles of stream habitat restored or things like that. We have to do that as well. But two things that we do, we have to do impact stories, and we have to roll up some kind of an impact story of work that we've done over the past year. And I don't think that's necessarily like what you would need to ask of all the FIPs, but it is a really useful thing to use for communication for us, for the National Sea Grant Office, and a lot of different ways to have this very simple impact story about something that we've completed over the course of a year. And we submit between 10 and 20 a year that we summarize. And then we also have to do an economic valuation of different things. It doesn't, like, in some cases it's jobs created, or it's and I'm happy to share any of this information with you, but there's different economic valuation things that we look at in terms of capacity or workforce or volunteer hours and things like that, to try to capture some of those economic benefits. And again, just to tell our story better too. So
thanks, Jesse. That's super helpful. Any other questions on this topic?
I have a question for folks that are involved in the FIPs. What does a successful FIP partnership look like?
Ooh, what does a successful FIP partnership look like? Eric, feeling it.
I know you know this.
On the spot.
That's a big question, Jesse. I mean, so we have sort of the formal definition around high-performing partnerships, have effective governance and a strategic action plan that are working together to collaboratively implement restoration, acquisition projects across the ecological, or in one or more of the ecological priorities. So that's sort of the formal definition of it, but I think effective FIP partnerships look different across the landscape. I mean, I know of some that have, a handful of real core partners that are implementing the work, and others that have dozens of partners that are doing the work. I think having strong leadership within a partnership is important, and a system for effectively replacing leaders as they move on to other positions, because that's something that's happened, I think, for almost every FIP during that 6-year time frame, is had leaders that have moved on, and I think the strong partnerships, the real effective FIPs, have been able to replace those leaders. And it's kind of, yeah, not saying they're not going to miss a step or anything, but continue on in that same trajectory.
Thanks,
So
Jesse.
I want to turn to Jillian to this, some of her thoughts on this too.
So I might give you an analogy that we actually talked about earlier this week with OWEB staff, which is the analogy of the FIP being like a bus and a road trip. So if the partnership is the bus and it's it's had its oil changed and it's got all of its however many point checks in its vehicle, it's a reliable vehicle to get you there. The strategic action plan is the roadmap of where they're going, set out, we know these stops in these dates and this time that it's going to take us. And what I feel is that a successful FIP is one that then the funding from the FIP is the fuel. And so they've already got their bus, they've already got their roadmap of where they need to go, and the funding just helps them get there more smoothly. So it's totally different way to look at it, but I find those that are most successful are really like ready to fill the tank. Everything else is in place and good to go.
I like that, Jillian.
One of the things that BEF found when they completed the last partnership learning project is also a successful partnership is one that is resilient to change. And Eric talked about one of those stressors or changes is staff turnover, but there are many stressors to partnerships. And successful partnerships are also resilient to all those stressors over time.
Thanks. Other questions, Jesse?
Oh, I was just going to add one thing. I'll echo everything that my colleagues have said, 100% agree. And I also think that we talked about this earlier in the week, but sometimes for, those partnerships that just really shine, there's just a little bit of extra magic that is something that's really hard for us to identify ahead of time. But, those partnerships that just have those really deep relationships with their community, a lot of trust built in their community, trust built with one another. Not that they all agree on everything 100% of the time, but that they can agree to disagree and still move forward in getting their work done. That's something that's really hard for us to get in a grant application. But when we work with those partners and we see that kind of partnership in action, we really do recognize that. And we also recognize that that's not going to happen everywhere in every FIP that we fund. But it's just really extra special when you do get to be a part of a FIP that has that. So.
Anything else, Jesse?
No, I can let everybody go.
No, this is great. And I think to wrap up, we were gonna ask or think about future committee topics. You are the only one here. And I think, Steph, you had some thoughts that you wanted to share on future committee topics.
Let's see. I don't have those in front of me, but yeah, happy to send those out to the committee. Was that me? Were you talking to me, Courtney?
Yeah, I was talking to you. I thought you had some thoughts, but I could be wrong. So I think we will likely maybe send a summary of this conversation around to the committee and see if folks have ideas or topics for the future committee. We can dive a little bit more into FIP reporting. If committee members have questions or some of the other reporting products that OWEB develops and reports that maybe aren't necessarily highlighted and shared with the board all the time, and there might be some other opportunities for conversations. And with that, I think I can turn it over to Jesse to wrap up.
Sarah, did you have something you wanted to say?
I was just going to share, it does sound like a number of our new board members are interested in joining this committee. So I think we will see an uptick in attendance, and I actually think it'll be really important to make sure that we cast a broader net with feedback. So I would suggest maybe Nicole can include in that topics conversation anybody who's expressed an interest in joining this committee recently, because we're going to kind of shuffle the decks and have a bunch of new members here. We'll make sure they go back and watch the 101 presentations from the last couple meetings here so they're caught up. It's all on YouTube, so that's easy to do.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Jesse.
Thanks, Jesse.
See everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.